What if I told you that one of the most visually stunning fantasy films ever made was also one of the biggest commercial disasters in Hollywood history? We're going to take a look at a movie that nearly bankrupted a studio, drove its director to the brink of madness, became the poster child for runaway productions, and ended up being a masterpiece that nobody saw. Yes, it's time to explore why the Adventures of Baron Munchausen failed so spectacularly, and why that failure might have been inevitable from day one. Now, before we dive into this beautiful disaster, we've got to understand what Hollywood looked like in 1988. And trust me, it was not a place where Terry Gilliam's brand of surreal, expensive fantasy was going to thrive. Picture this. It's the height of the Reagan boom, and Hollywood is obsessed with one thing: making safe bets that guarantee massive returns. Top Gun had made $356 million worldwide 2 years earlier. Fatal Attraction was pulling in huge numbers with relatively modest budgets. The industry had learned that you could make serious money with high-concept, marketable films that didn't require audiences to think too hard. Meanwhile, the fantasy genre was basically cursed. The Dark Crystal had disappointed at the box office in 1982. Labyrinth, despite being a David Bowie vehicle, had flopped in 1986 with only $12.9 million domestic. Even Willow, which came out the same year as Baron Munchausen, struggled to find its audience. Hollywood had basically decided that elaborate fantasy films were box office poison, especially ones that couldn't be easily marketed to kids or adults. Enter Terry Gilliam, fresh off the critical success of Brazil, a film that famously battled Universal Studios and became a symbol of artistic integrity versus corporate control. Gilliam was riding high as the champion of visionary filmmaking, but he was also branded as difficult, uncompromising, and expensive. The guy who fought studios for his vision and usually won. Not exactly what executives were looking for in 1988, but Columbia Pictures was desperate. They'd just endured a string of failures and needed something that could compete with the major studios. When Gilliam pitched an adaptation of the classic Baron Munchausen stories, tales of an 18th century German nobleman who tells impossible lies about his adventures, Columbia saw potential prestige and international appeal. The original budget was set at $23.5 million, which was ambitious, but not crazy for a prestige picture. Columbia figured they had their 4 weddings and a funeral, a British production that could win awards and make money internationally. What they got was a production that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. And honestly, the warning signs were there from day one. So what happened when the Adventures of Baron Munchausen went into production? Well, let me put it this way. If you wanted to create a textbook example of everything that could go wrong with a big budget film, you couldn't have designed it better than this. The budget was supposed to be $23.5 million. That's already ambitious for 1988, but not insane. By the time filming wrapped, they'd spent over $46 million, nearly double the original budget. To put that in perspective, that's more than Back to the Future Part 2 cost the following year. And that film had massive special effects and time travel sequences. But the money problems were just the beginning. Gilliam's perfectionist tendencies, which had served him well on smaller projects, became a nightmare on this scale. He would reshoot scenes dozens of times, demand elaborate sets be rebuilt if they didn't match his vision, and refuse to compromise on any detail. The famous moon sequence? They built multiple full-scale moon sets because Gilliam wasn't satisfied with how they looked on camera. We're talking about sets that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars being scrapped and rebuilt because the shadows weren't quite right. Then, there were the location disasters. They filmed in Spain, Italy, and the UK, and every location brought new problems. Equipment broke down in remote Spanish locations with no backup available. Weather destroyed expensive sets that had taken weeks to build. Local crews couldn't keep up with Gilliam's demands and didn't understand his vision. The production became so chaotic that crew members started calling it The Adventures of Baron Munchausen's Budget. And here's where things got really ugly. Columbia Pictures was going through its own crisis during production. The executives who had greenlit the project were being replaced, and the new regime had no investment in Gilliam's vision. They started demanding cuts and changes while filming was still happening, creating even more chaos on set. Imagine trying to direct a massive fantasy epic while studio executives are literally rewriting your script and questioning every expense. Charles McKeown, who co-wrote the script with Gilliam, later said that watching the production was like watching someone try to build a cathedral with Lego blocks. Technically possible, but probably not the best approach. John Neville, who played the Baron, described the experience as the most beautiful insanity I've ever been part of. By the end, they had a movie that looked absolutely stunning, but had nearly killed everyone involved in making it. But here's where we need to be honest about something that nobody wanted to admit in 1988. The production nightmare wasn't the only reason Baron Munchausen failed. The film itself had some serious problems that made it nearly impossible for audiences to connect with, no matter how beautiful it looked. Let's start with the story structure. Baron Munchausen is essentially a series of episodic adventures loosely connected by the Baron's storytelling. He tells tales about visiting the moon, going underwater to meet Neptune, escaping from a Turkish army, but there's no real narrative momentum driving these sequences forward. It's like watching the most expensive anthology series ever made, where each segment is gorgeous but doesn't build toward anything meaningful. The Baron himself is an unreliable narrator who may or may not be telling the truth about his adventures. That's a sophisticated literary device, but it creates a fundamental problem for movie audiences. How do you invest emotionally in a character who might be lying about everything? John Neville gives a wonderful performance, but the Baron remains distant and unknowable throughout the film. He's more of a storytelling device than a person you can care about. Then there's the tone problem. Gilliam wrapped genuinely dark themes: war, death, the crushing of imagination by bureaucracy, in whimsical fairy tale presentation. The film opens with a city under siege, features graphic violence, and deals with existential questions about reality versus fantasy. But it's packaged like a children's adventure story. Kids were confused by the philosophical elements, while adults felt like they were watching an overgrown fairy tale. Test audiences were brutal. Preview screenings saw significant walkouts, not because the film was bad, but because people genuinely didn't understand what they were watching. Was it a comedy? A drama? A children's film? An art movie? The film's refusal to fit into any recognizable category made audiences uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the budget problems. And let's be real about the self-indulgence factor. Gilliam created sequences that were visually stunning, but served no dramatic purpose. The dance sequence with Uma Thurman as Venus is beautiful, but it stops the movie dead for several minutes. The escape from the moon feels like Gilliam showing off his imagination rather than advancing the story. These weren't necessarily bad creative choices, but they prioritized visual spectacle over audience engagement. The competition context makes this even clearer. In 1988, audiences were choosing films like Big, A Fish Called Wanda, and Beetlejuice, movies that knew exactly what they were and delivered clear, satisfying experiences. Baron Munchausen demanded that viewers work to understand it, and most people just weren't interested in doing that work. But even if Baron Munchausen had been a perfectly structured crowd pleaser, it still would have faced an almost impossible uphill battle. Everything about the 1988 entertainment landscape was aligned against its success. Let's start with the genre curse. Fantasy films were basically box office poison in the late 1980s. The Dark Crystal had lost money. Labyrinth had flopped. Legend, despite starring Tom Cruise, had disappointed. Even Willow, which came out the same year with massive Lucas backing, struggled to find an audience. Studios had concluded that audiences simply didn't want elaborate fantasy adventures, especially ones that couldn't be easily categorized as either kids' movies or adult entertainment. Then there was the marketing impossibility. How do you sell a surreal fantasy about an old man telling impossible stories to an audience expecting clear genre conventions? Colombia's marketing department was genuinely stumped. The film didn't fit into any recognizable categories. It wasn't a kids' movie despite having a child protagonist. It wasn't an action adventure despite having adventure sequences. It wasn't a comedy despite being frequently hilarious. It was Terry Gilliam being Terry Gilliam, and that's not something you can easily put on a poster. The trailers made it look like a children's fantasy, which alienated adult audiences who might have appreciated Gilliam's visual artistry and satirical edge. But the film's sophisticated themes and dark undertones made it inappropriate for young children. They'd created a movie that existed in the gap between audiences, and nobody knew how to bridge that gap. The release strategy was equally confused. Colombia gave it a limited release in December 1988, hoping for awards consideration, but the film was too weird for Oscar voters who were looking for prestige dramas. Then, they expanded it in early 1989, but by then word of mouth about the production problems had overshadowed any discussion of the film's actual merits. People knew it as that movie that went way over budget before they knew anything about the story. International sales were supposed to save the film. European audiences were generally more receptive to Gilliam's work, but even overseas distributors struggled with how to position it. The film performed better in Europe than domestically, but not nearly enough to recoup that massive $46 million budget. The box office numbers tell the brutal story. Baron Munchausen made only $8.1 million domestically against that $46 million budget. Even with international sales bringing the total to around $15 million worldwide, it was one of the biggest financial disasters in Colombia's history. The studio lost over $30 million on a single film, which was devastating for a company already struggling financially. Critics were divided in ways that didn't help box office. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars and called it a magnificent folly, which captures the critical consensus perfectly. Beautiful, but fundamentally flawed. That kind of mixed response doesn't drive ticket sales. But here's the beautiful irony. Time has been incredibly kind to the Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and many of the things that made it a commercial disaster in 1988 are exactly what make it remarkable today. Visually, the film has aged like fine wine. Gilliam's decision to use practical effects and elaborate sets instead of cutting-edge 1988 technology means Baron Munchausen still looks stunning today. Those expensive moon sets that nearly bankrupted Colombia, they're more convincing now than most CGI environments. The underwater sequences with Oliver Reed as Vulcan look like living Renaissance paintings, while other films from 1988 show their age through dated special effects. Baron Munchausen's handcrafted approach feels timeless. The film's themes about imagination versus bureaucracy, art versus commerce, and the power of storytelling feel more relevant than ever. In an era of focus group entertainment and corporate-controlled franchises, Baron Munchausen's celebration of pure creative vision seems prophetic rather than self-indulgent. The film's criticism of rational bureaucrats who want to eliminate wonder and magic hits differently when you're living through the Marvel Cinematic Universe era. Streaming has given the film a complete second life. Viewers discovering it on Netflix or Amazon Prime don't carry the baggage of its production history or box office failure. They can appreciate Gilliam's vision without knowing it nearly killed Columbia Pictures. And crucially, streaming audiences have different expectations. They're more willing to engage with unconventional narratives and patient pacing than 1988 moviegoers were. The critical rehabilitation has been remarkable. The Criterion Collection released a beautiful edition that treats Baron Munchausen as the work of art it always was. Film schools study it as an example of uncompromising artistic vision. Modern critics who dismissed it in 1988 have quietly revised their opinions. It regularly appears on lists of underrated masterpieces and visually stunning films. Terry Gilliam's reputation has undergone a similar transformation. He went from being seen as a cautionary tale about runaway directors to being celebrated as a visionary who was simply working in the wrong system. Film students and aspiring directors study Baron Munchausen not as an example of what not to do, but as proof that artistic integrity sometimes requires commercial sacrifice. The real vindication is that Baron Munchausen now stands as everything that's missing from modern blockbuster filmmaking: genuine imagination, handcrafted artistry, and willingness to prioritize wonder over marketability. So there you have it. Baron Munchausen failed because it was the right film at the wrong time. The tragedy isn't that Gilliam made a bad movie. It's that Hollywood wasn't ready for his vision. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe for more beautiful disasters, and let me know. Safe sequels or glorious failures? Catch y'all next time at Past America.